Zelensky round two. President Trump accusing Ukrainian President Zelensky of, quote, inflammatory statements today in a lengthy social media post after Zelensky reiterated he would not concede any territory to Russia, including Crimea, which was annexed in 2014 during the Obama administration. Trump's post came just hours after his vice president, J.D. Vance, said Europe may need to get the deal over the finish line and suggested freezing Ukraine's territorial lines where they are today. CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh is in London with new reporting on all this. And Nick, European leaders tell you that President Trump still does very much want a peace deal.
Yeah, certainly a European official I spoke to said that this latest bout of pressure really seems to be about the Trump administration trying to honour its belief it could get a peace deal done in the first 100 days. They've got about a week left, and we've heard in past days Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying that they might potentially walk if there wasn't some sort of deal coming forwards. There's supposed to have been today progress in London. The United States Secretary of State Rubio himself, Steve Witkoff, the presidential envoy to Russia and part of this conflict as well, were all supposed to have got together. That meeting significantly downgraded, and lower level officials indeed met. And in fact, after it, and indeed after that Truth Social post by President Trump, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said today was a day in which emotions had run high. And so clearly this issue of the recognition of Crimea as being part of Russia, it's not entirely clear if the US would like to see Ukraine do that. It's a red line. Zelensky said he won't tolerate or contemplate. It's not even allowed by the Ukrainian constitution, or whether this is really the US saying it might recognize Crimea as part of Russia, as part of a concession to get Moscow closer to some kind of deal. It seems to have stirred up tempers and I think increased tension around exactly what can be achieved. In that Truth Social post, what we don't actually know is what is required of Ukraine at this stage. Publicly, that's not been made clear. Trump wants Zelensky to get it done. We just don't know what the it is yet, Jake.
On that Truth Social post from President Trump, he also said, quote, nobody is asking Zelensky to recognize Crimea as Russian territory, but if he wants Crimea, why didn't they fight for it 11 years ago when it was handed over to Russia without a shot being fired, unquote. Now, you reported from Ukraine in 2014. Is that what happened?
Yeah, look, just to point out, Zelensky was a TV producer back then, a very different global political climate, and in fact, a bit of a vacuum of power, frankly, in Kiev when little green men, the Russia said had nothing to do with it, marched into Crimea in 2014. The US, Europe weren't willing to provide arms to get into the fight to assist Ukraine. Ukraine's army was in tatters, and so yes, frankly, without a shot for the better part of it, in 2014, Russian troops moved in to an area which in the 50s had, under the Soviet Union, been part of Russia and handed over to Ukraine under the Soviet government then. So only recently, in the larger history, changed hands. But it was such a different world then, frankly. The West not willing to confront Russia, who they'd had a better relationship with. Massive sanctions against Russia after that particular moment. But it's an exceptionally difficult world. Different world now, we find, with a full-scale invasion in 2022 by Russia of their neighbour. So very different times, hard to compare, Jake.
How do you view the way the administration is handling this?
Look, I think it's fine, Casey, that they want a ceasefire. Everybody should, even if Mr. Putin doesn't. But they've got it wrong, fundamentally wrong, in two ways. First, when you go for a ceasefire, you should simply go for a cessation of hostilities. Maybe you have some type of a peacekeeping force. But think of the ceasefires that have held over history. The one on the Korean Peninsula, the one in Cyprus. They were simple ceasefires. They didn't try to settle the big so-called final status issues. So that's the first mistake, throwing things like NATO and Crimea into it. Secondly, the things they've thrown into it are totally one-sided. This is a pro-Russian position. Let's just call it out for what it is. So it's wrong methodologically by introducing final status issues up front. And then secondly, it exacerbates that by introducing positions that are very much what Mr. Putin wants to hear on NATO, Crimea, and so forth. Thirdly, it's not explicit, but it worries me. When the vice president and the president talk about walking away, what worries me is not simply they're thinking about walking away from the peace process or negotiations. I worry they're setting Ukraine up to be the fall guy, and they're talking about abandoning not simply negotiations, but abandoning Ukraine And I think that would be morally and strategically deeply, deeply wrong.
What do you make of the fact that we're learning that Steve Witkoff is going to go back to Moscow? How do you look at his role in all of this and how it plays into kind of that scenario that you laid out of the prospect of America abandoning not just these negotiations, but Ukraine?
Look, all I know is that ever since Mr. Witkoff's been involved and been doing his shuttles to Moscow, the U.S. position is increasingly pretty much the same as the Russian position. And so, again, I'm not privy to those negotiations, obviously. All I can look at is the result and what is said publicly. But so far, at least, I don't see anything constructive that has come from as many hours of sitting face to face with Vladimir Putin.
Where do these talks stand?
Well, just I think 2 minutes ago, President Zelensky responded to President Trump by tweeting that emotions were running high today. I think it was an interesting description of the war of words between him and President Trump. And I think that Trump and Zelensky are stuck because Trump's plan, which is more or less what President Putin wants, is very, very far from what President Zelensky is willing to do. And this is why, at the moment, it doesn't seem that there's a deal in the making. We have to also, admit that Zelensky's response wasn't very accurate when it comes to what Trump proposed. Trump did not ask Zelensky to recognize Crimea as part of Russia. He just said that in a peace deal that ends the war, the US will recognize Crimea as part of Russia. Obviously, that's something that the Ukrainians are very much against, but at least the way that Zelensky portrayed it wasn't very accurate.
Certainly not Ukraine recognizing Crimea as part of Russia there. Okay, so talk to us about some of the hangups here, because you have the vice president this morning. He said the deal would freeze the territorial lines at some level close to where they are today, and we're going to actually put in place the kind of long-term diplomatic settlement that hopefully will lead to long-term peace. Is there an indication that Vladimir Putin would be placated by freezing those territorial lines close to where they are today?
I think that Putin more or less signaled in his meetings with Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, that he's willing to freeze the war along those lines as long as the U.S. recognizes Crimea as part of Russia, and as long as the U.S. De facto recognizes that the territory that Putin occupied since the invasion in 2022 will stay part of Russia, even if the U.S. doesn't recognize it officially. So on territory, the U.S. proposal almost matches what Putin wants. But Putin doesn't agree to the other part of Trump's proposal, which is that Ukraine will have a robust security guarantee, that international forces will be positioned inside Ukraine. Those are things that Putin completely rejects. He wants Ukraine to be, demilitarized, without an army, definitely without international forces. So this is why, by the way, Putin still hasn't said yes to this proposal either. Witkoff is going to be again on Friday in Moscow to see Putin, and we'll see if he comes out with a yes from the Russian president. I'm not sure this will be the case.
This push we're hearing about of the Trump administration to get this done in the first 100 days of the president's tenure in the White House, that's according to a European official. That's coming up very quickly next week. I mean, how are you viewing that as a deadline?
Well, we have to remember, during the campaign, Trump said he will end the war even during the transition, even before he's being inaugurated. That did not happen. I do not see. We're very close to the 100 days. I think it's like in a week or so, or 2 weeks. It's not a realistic objective. Trump and his team tried very hard in the last 2, 3 weeks to get something, which is short of ending the war, just a 30-day ceasefire. They couldn't get that. And I think that this is because Putin feels that in the battlefield he has the upper hand at the moment. He sees that Zelensky is under a lot of pressure from the US. So Putin is not under any pressure and is not going to accept anything that is short of his maximalist demands.
Zelensky said he's open to meeting with Trump. They're both going to be in Rome for Pope Francis's funeral, of course. Do you see that happening?
I don't know. I just know one thing. Trump and Zelensky met several times over the last few months. I think the record shows that it might not be a good idea. I mean, we all remember what happened the last time they met in the Oval Office. And I know that people around Zelensky are urging him not to push for such a meeting because the conditions are not ripe and such a meeting could once again explode and create an even bigger crisis. So I don't think that while Zelensky is saying that he wants to meet Trump in Rome, people around Zelensky are urging him not to do it.